Okay, I think we're recording. So this quick video kind of brings you up to date as to um, how we got to the point where we had the Declaration of Independence. So let me see if I can share some slides with you, and we will go from there. I'm hoping you can see these slides now. Like I said, this is a little history up to the Declaration of Independence. These three documents are kind of important in the sense that they are the beginnings where people begin to claim their own rights. Up to this point in time, there was the monarchy system in England where the king and queen took power from divine right, meaning that they claimed that God gave their family the power to be the leaders. But slowly and surely, as you can see, very slowly, people in England began to claim rights for themselves. For example, 1215, the Magna Carta limited power of the government for the first time. So this was a document that limited the power of the king and queen. And there were other documents around the world, in Africa and other places, that were doing the same thing. But for us, in the development of the Declaration of Independence, or getting to the Declaration of Independence, the Magna Carta is really the first step in that direction. And you see some other documents there, 1628, the Petition of Right, which means that the Parliament, which was made up of people and nobles, were given the power to tax, and the English Bill of Rights in 1689. And then, of course, some of these things of American history. 1607 was really the first settlement in the New World at Jamestown, and then, of course, the great story of the Mayflower, right, of these pilgrims who were being persecuted for religious purposes, not because they were too lenient, but because they were too strict, and the people of England were like, "Hey, you need to not be here anymore." And so they hopped on a boat called the Mayflower and headed over to the New World. On the way over, they were kind of figuring out, they had a lot of time, so they were like, what should we do once we get there? And they wrote the Mayflower Compact, which was a document that pledged that they would govern themselves in the New World. This concept of self-government, that there would be no king and queen, and that the people would have equal rights, or I should say all the men would have equal rights. And you can see this quote here: "We solemnly and mutually covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politique for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends." So that was a huge step. This slide, this is not really you need to know, but just kind of know these three different kinds of colonies, the 13 colonies. There were the royal colonies that were governed by a governor that was appointed directly by the king. So these colonies, the royal colonies, were most loyal to the king, and you see who they are: Georgia, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia. The next kind of colonies were called the proprietary colonies. This was land granted by a family or a group that owned property in the New World. These were a little bit more removed from the king. The leaders of these colonies were appointed by the proprietors, the owners of the land. And there were only three of those: Delaware, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. And the third kind of colony, the colonies that were furthest away from the king, were called charter colonies. They were charter colonies because there was a company that owned the land, and that company really was the company that governed those colonies, two small colonies, Connecticut and Rhode Island. And so most of the colonies you see here were loyal to the king, and then there were about 5 colonies that were further away from the governance of the king. There were these two philosophies as well about how England was governing the colonies. The first one called salutary neglect. This means that colonies kind of developed without much supervision because, for 2 reasons: they were so far away, it took a long time for communication to go back and forth. But they were kind of left to themselves because of a concept called mercantilism. And this was the idea that um, power equals wealth. And so the more wealth a country had, like England, the more power they had. And what was happening with these new colonies is that the new colonies were sending England these raw materials like tobacco and cotton and things like that. And England would make them into finished goods and then send them back to be sold in the colonies. So everyone seemed to be making money off this concept of mercantilism. And so as long as the colonies were making money for the king and for England, there was this concept of salutary neglect, right? Just let them do what they want. Who really cares? If everyone's making money, we're all very happy. But then there were these wars going on in Europe as well, right? Both in Europe and in the New World. In Europe, there was the constant wars between France and England, and that kind of spilled over into the colonies, right? The British colonies, the 13 colonies, were fighting with the French colonies further west. And this is where we get to kind of the stories that we know with George Washington. He was a young general. He kind of screwed things up here in the French and Indian War. You can see the years here, 1754 to 1763. He was working for the state of Virginia and loyal to the British, and went out to fight some French soldiers and killed them, and tried to run away, but didn't get very far. So he built this crappy little fort called Fort Necessity, which was not very strong. And because of that, he had to retreat. And that kind of got things going in the French and Indian War. It was kind of George Washington's fault. And so there was this war going on in the colonies between England and France, as well as back in Europe between England and France. Yeah, we won't talk about that one. So there was this trouble brewing here back in the colonies, and were Americans full-fledged British citizens, or were the British simply exploiting and taking advantage of the colonies? Meanwhile, there was all these war debts being piled up, these war debts that the colonies and the British were taking on because of them trying to defend themselves against the French, both in the colonies and back in Europe. So how do you pay for this defense? How do you pay for these wars? Well, the British Parliament passed the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act, which were both taxes on the colonists to help pay for the defense. This is not out of line from anything else. This is what governments normally do, right? When they're defending someone, they kind of get paid for it. But the colonists didn't like it. As you see here, some of the famous quotes, there were these famous boycotts against sugar and against using the stamps or the government issued documents that were taxed through the Stamp Act. And so colonists begin to boycott these things. The term no taxation without representation becomes popular. And this is even more interesting today because I'm not sure if you know this, but Washington, D.C. is not represented in the Congress of the United States. And so they are claiming that they are being taxed without representation. In fact, that slogan is on their license plates. But it became popular during this time. And then, of course, famous quotes like from this one by Patrick Henry, "Give me liberty," or "Give me death," all trying to inspire people to want to be free from the colonists and at least have some representation. So the colonists decided to form and meet together in what they call the Stamp Act Congress. This is in New York City. 9 colonies came, so not even all 13. They wrote up a document called the Declaration of Rights and Grievances and sent it on to the king, and they said we should not have taxation without representation. And guess what happened? The Stamp Act was repealed. That's right, the colonists, or the parliament, the British parliament and the king listened to the colonists and said, you know, if we think you're right, we'll repeal the Stamp Act. That's probably too much taxes on you. So I want to make this clear, there wasn't, as we talk about revolutions around the world since then, and we talk about oppression and things like that, this really wasn't the kind of oppression that we think is going on maybe in countries today. This was kind of like just a negotiation taking place over many years. But then more trouble happened a few years after that. The parliament needed more money, so they passed the Townshend Acts. which was a tax on a lot of things, as you see here. There was the incident of the Boston Massacre, which really wasn't a massacre. There was only 5 colonists killed. In this story, you can watch things about this story of the Boston Massacre, where there was a group of British soldiers who were being harassed every day by the colonists, called names like lobsterbacks and redcoats and things like that. And so one winter night, there was this skirmish and snowballs being thrown and ice balls being thrown, and a group of scared British soldiers kind of opened fire on a group of people who were harassing them. 5 colonists were killed, including the first one. They say the first one is a guy named Crispus Attucks, who was the first one killed in the Boston Massacre. And he was an African American, a free African American in Boston at the time. An interesting thing, too, about the Boston Massacre, John Adams, who was a lawyer in the Boston area at the time, was the lawyer for the British soldiers in their defense. So again, I mean, this wasn't like people getting killed all the time. This was just kind of a little skirmish, a misunderstanding. But they called it the Boston Massacre. The colonists did for propaganda reasons, to kind of continue to develop this need for freedom. You all know about the Boston Tea Party in 1773, where a group of people said, they had a meeting at the town hall or whatever, and they were like, no more time for talking. And they marched down to the docks, and they jumped onto a ship and dumped the tea into Boston Harbor. The result of this was called the Coercive Acts. This was another group of laws that the Parliament in England passed. It was called the Coercive Acts in England, and the colonists called it the Intolerable Acts. Like, this was the last straw. A couple of these things was the Port Bill, which closed Boston Harbor. That's right, it closed Boston Harbor, so nothing was coming in or coming out. And this kind of forced the other colonies to see what was happening in Boston and began to support Boston by sending products and goods and food and things up into Boston. And the point of the Coercive Acts was to punish the colonists, but basically what it did was kind of brought them closer together, kind of forced them to be closer together. So that kind of backfired on the king and Parliament. So the colonists decided to have another meeting. This was called the First Continental Congress in 1774. It took place in Philadelphia. 12 colonies came, so there was still one colony who was not part of this. Not much occurred during the First Continental Congress, except for they agreed to form what's called committees of correspondence. These were committees inside each colony that would kind of write to each other and keep each other informed and keep in touch with each other. And again, it made them like be closer together rather than separate them. And the big thing they decided to do was to meet again. And so, before they got to meet again, there was the little skirmish in Lexington and Concord up near Boston. This was in April of 1775. The British were searching for John Hancock and John Adams, and they were running away. And the colonists and the Minutemen, right, were there and trying to fight back a little bit. This is the story of Paul Revere, the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, where he said, he ran through the towns yelling, the British are coming, and they put up the lamps in the Old North Church, one if by land, two if by sea, et cetera, et cetera. And the skirmishes that took place in Lexington and Concord between the colonists and the British soldiers became known as the Shot Heard Round the World. That this was really the first time that a group of people or a country was trying to claim their independence from a large, powerful country like England. In the meantime, a man named Thomas Paine wrote this little pamphlet called Common Sense, and it kind of outlined why the colonists should be independent. It got a lot of press. You can see 150,000 copies were printed. That's a lot in 1776, and they figured out that one out of every 8 white men in the colonies read this pamphlet saying that we needed to be independent. And so when finally the Second Continental Congress meets in 1776 in Philadelphia again, all 13 colonies are there. And you see some of the collection of people that were there. I mean, what a collection of thinkers, of fighters. John Hancock was the president of the Second Continental Congress. Ben Franklin was there. Thomas Jefferson was there from Virginia. John Adams from Massachusetts. Richard Henry Lee from Virginia. All meeting together at the Second Continental Congress. George Washington was not there because he was appointed the commander-in-chief of the colonial army and was out fighting the British in the meantime. And so questions that I want you to think about is these concepts of Hobbes or Locke. You already know about these people, Hobbes or Locke. Hobbes is all about if you leave people alone, they're going to do the wrong thing and they're going to cheat and lie, and someone needs to put them in line. Or there's this Enlightenment thinker, John Locke, who was, saying we just got to let people be who they are because they will do the right thing. So this is the questions they were pondering at the Second Continental Congress. Who should have the power? Who will have the power in a new country? Who has the right to have the power? There's a movie called 1776. It's a great movie, and I highly recommend you watching it. I think we have it available at the high school library if you want to check it out, or maybe find it on YouTube or Netflix, or I don't know if it's on any of those things, but it's a great movie about the Second Continental Congress. And I know you would enjoy it. So please watch that, and thanks for listening. Let me see if I can stop the, I can't, I don't know how to do this. Stop share. Here we go. Thanks again for watching, and do your assignments, and let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.